Everybody, welcome to Supervillain Spotlight Episode 1. Of course, this is the kind of follow-up to our first series from Daventry Studios called Bring on the Bad Guys. We're changing it. That's the name of a Marvel Comics series. Actually, more than one, and we just wanted to clear out any confusion as far as that goes. So Supervillain Spotlight it is, moving forward. And in Episode 1 here, we are focusing on supervillains that first fought Superman in the 1930s and 1940s. Of course, we're doing this because this weekend, the new Superman movie is in theaters. Finally, the much anticipated James Gunn directed film. So we're looking at Superman villains from his early days. Not quite as strong of a rogues gallery as some other heroes' early villains, such as Spider-Man or Batman. Still, we have some heavy hitters. So we're going to get down to it here. Each villain ranked in 5 categories: personality, powers, or lack thereof, mythology, design, and cultural impact. So to clarify, mythology, anything that happens in the comics, any great storylines all go into that category. Cultural impact, anything that happens off the pages of the comic. Have they influenced popular culture, etc.? So we're going to start off with a very obscure villain, and actually there's a lot of obscure villains in the early pages of Superman. Surprisingly, he fought a lot of just regular people, bank robbers, grifters, scam artists, con men, people like that, which is super interesting when you read the comics because the authors and writers had to come up with ways for Superman, with all these superpowers, to take care of villains that were nowhere near as powerful as he was. So, of course, this is also before he got all the superpowers that we now know that he has. But still, it's surprising that not a lot of these villains actually have superpowers. So we're going to start with, at number 10, Funny Face. We actually don't know his real name, and he only has appeared in about 5 comics, I believe, to this point in history. Never was revisited, which is kind of a surprise to me, in that his power set seems to lend itself to someone like Keith Giffen writing modern comics. I mean, his face is basically an emoji. He's a comic artist, and he's down on his luck, and he discovers a superpower that allows him to bring cartoons to life, and he uses those to fight Superman, to rob banks, etc. And that's a power set that I feel like could be used pretty well these days, but he hasn't really shown up much at all since the 40s. He appeared in Superman 19. That was his first appearance. Not much known about him, including his name is not known. So there's a lot of people that could have been number 10. Very low rankings. Personality and powers and design all at 2. Mythology and cultural impact both at 1s. So a lot of people actually tied, and I just chose him because I felt like he could be brought into the modern era probably easiest. The next 2, so they're both going to be number 9, and I just put them on the same number because they are so closely thought of, when they are thought of at all. And that is the 2 villains that showed up in the first ever Superman appearance, which is, of course, the famous Action Comics number 1. Not much to say about these 2 either. We have B. Carroll and Butch Matson. And like Funny Face, they haven't really shown up a lot since, except for reprints of Action Comics number 1 or retellings of that story. B. Matson, basically the first villain Superman ever brought to justice. She framed a innocent person for murder. She was on the loose. Superman heard about it and brought her in. That is literally about the entire story. Butch Matson, only slightly more significant. He had the grand motivation of Lois Lane not wanting to dance with him. That's what turned him into a villain. He was already a villain, but kind of a mobster. Lois didn't want to dance with him. She was actually on a date with Clark. Clark had been asking Lois out, apparently, and Lois, out of kindness and because she felt sorry for Clark, went on a date. Butch cut in when they were dancing. Lois didn't want to dance with him. Clark had to pretend to be, mild-mannered reporter. And Superman had to save the day when Butch decided to kidnap Lois. Butch is probably most famous for appearing on the cover of Action Comics #1. He is the gentleman running away from Superman, lifting the car. So that is Butch Matson. Nothing to write home about as far as stories after that. Again, never really showed up. So we're kind of going through these mostly one-dimensional characters at this point. Next on the list, we do have someone who is significant, but not really for anything that he did. And that is Daniel Rivers, a.k.a. Swami Riva. And for some reason, I always think about Stephen Foster and Swanee River when I think about this villain. Again, early supervillain for Superman, no superpowers. And he is a con man who posed as a fortune teller who would, the standard little old lady, yeah, I'll tell you about your life and how it's going to go. And he would take all their money. And Superman heard about this, investigated, and initially Swami Riva caused some problems for Superman because of a certain rock that was used to fasten the turban of Swami Riva. And that turned out to be kryptonite. Of course, the full story of kryptonite much later was put together, was cobbled together. But this is the first time in Superman 61 that kryptonite shows up, even though it was developed for a radio show beforehand. It also was initially colored red, and that was later retconned to be green. So if you see a reprint of this issue, a lot of times it's been recolored green to match up with the now traditional color of kryptonite. His first appearance, along with kryptonite, he doesn't actually have any superpowers of his own, just what the kryptonite causes to happen to Superman. Again, just another testament to the early storytelling powers in the comic book world of using that very slight plot point and expanding that to something so significant today. When we say someone has a weakness, it's their kryptonite. Kryptonite first appeared here in the hands of the fake Swami Riva. He also didn't really show up much past that as well, but you can see a lot of reprints about that first issue because it is so significant for the appearance of kryptonite. Next on the list, we have one of my personal favorites, J. Wilbur Wolfingham, and he actually was based, at least in part, on the comedian W.C. Fields, and he is another con artist, as we're going to get a lot of those coming through here. He actually is kind of our first villain that recurs in stories that aren't reprints. That's not to say there's a lot of recurring, because he also does not show up that often at all. I think maybe his last appearance was a few years ago. He doesn't have a very complex character, although his nephew's name is Wormwood, which may be a nod to the C.S. Lewis book, The Screwtape Letters, or not. It also is just a fun name, and also a name that it feels like W.C. Fields would come up with for someone he doesn't like. He first appeared in Superman 26, that's January 1944. Most of his schemes, his con artist schemes, involve finances and him running away with a decent chunk of money. He was invented by Don Cameron and Ira Yarborough. His most famous scheme, which is also a little bit more recent, is at one point an alien and he met, and he convinced the alien that he owned the planet Earth and sold it to the alien, and then that didn't work out so well with all the parties involved, which actually isn't that far off from a non-fictional event that happened probably about 10, 15 years ago. A lady in Florida, of course Florida, wanted to claim ownership of the sun and then charge people for it, which of course did not last very long when it got into the court system. So J. Wilbur Wolfingham sounds like a W.C. Fields name. If you're not familiar with W.C. Fields, he would come up with some pretty outlandish names for his characters and his films. The first word that Wolfingham ever speaks in the pages of a comic book of Superman 26 is cease. And we know, or I know, but if you're a W.C. Fields fan, you know also that that's a word that W.C. Fields used. And we ranked him, his personality, a little bit higher, but his powers at a 1, mythology 2, design 2, cultural impact 1, and his personality at a 3. So that's 9 overall. So again, we've got a lot of lower ranking villains here, which is not going to be the case with most groups. Moving on to number 6. We have kind of an unusual story about this villain that happened off the pages of the comic, but it is the Puzzler. And as you can imagine, the Puzzler's theme, very similar to the Riddler's, probably is the most accurate similarity in the DC universe, except the Puzzler mostly focused on actual puzzles and like board games, chess, checkers. And also The other thing, too, is that Riddler is often known as actually having a pretty decently strong intelligence and IQ. And so the riddles he comes up with are indeed his own creations, and he thinks about them, and they can be hard to solve. Whereas the puzzler, more or less, just really good at cheating. He, at one point, did claim to be one of the best checkers players in the world. He also appeared, this is the interesting story, he appeared actually in the 1960s Batman television show. He was played by Maurice Evans, who would go on to play Dr. Zaius in Planet of the Apes. The story there is that originally the character was going to be the Riddler again, but there was some contractual dispute, and he was not able to appear, so the showrunners called up DC and said, hey, can we use the puzzler instead? They did use him, and he also has mostly disappeared into obscurity. His personality we have ranked at 3, and his cultural impact 2, just because of that very short-lived stint in the Batman 1960s TV universe. Everything else ranked as a 1, which gives him 9 as well. He was created by Jerry Siegel and John Ciccola. Now we can kind of put the folks that didn't have any staying power at all behind us and move on to someone who at least has shown up in some pretty significant Superman stories, and that is the Prankster, aka Oswald Loomis. He first appeared in Action Comics 51 in August of 1942. Think of the Prankster as a cross between the Riddler and the Joker. He's not sadistic like the Joker is. Like, he's not an agent of chaos, but he likes pranks, so he will use, pop guns, squirting flowers, pies in the face, like that style of weaponry and gadgetry. He likes to have fun. He doesn't have the intellectual capacity of someone like the Riddler. So he's kind of a cross in between those two characters, which is also a reason why he has probably not lasted as long in terms of being an upper echelon villain. He's just not unique enough in a lot of ways. He did at one point team up with the Joker, and then he double-crossed the Joker. The Joker got upset. Superman then worked with the Joker to try to catch the Prankster. Then the Joker wanted to kill the Prankster, and Superman didn't want that to happen, and so it was this whole big mess. And the Prankster also, a very significant moment in his history, he was involved in the famous Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow story, and he has shown up in a couple animated series, the Superman animated 1980s show and New Adventures of Superman as well. We rank him 12, putting him at a 3 for personality, 2 for powers, 3 in mythology, 2 for design, and 2 for cultural impact due to those limited appearances on TV. Now we're moving on to maybe the first villain that you have heard of, and also it kind of illustrates something that we're going to talk about probably quite a bit here in this series, and that is the DC multiverse / their rebooting system. And DC does this much more than Marvel does. They essentially have a series of retcons and reboots to their universe where the multiverse either sets or resets, and that kind of leads to some confusion amongst backstories for villains, which we'll get into a little bit later. Sometimes the villains are drastically different from one universe to another, so we're going to kind of try to conglomerate them as much as we can, which can be difficult, as you'll probably see here with this next villain, the Toyman. Winslow Schott is his name. There have been multiple Toyman characters in the DC universe, but before we get into kind of the Toyman's history, it's interesting to note that he has a huge variety of shifts in his personality and his story. And he was initially created by Don Cameron and Ed Dobrotka, and that's in the pages of Action Comics 64, which was in 1943. And he started off very much a villain of his time. His shtick was toys, and he used toys as weapons. And that was kind of the order of the day in the golden age of comics, was that you had your shtick, you went with it. That was kind of it, more or less. There, was not a lot of depth to these characters initially. And so at the start, it seemed very much like he was a Superman-type villain. But he eventually kind of turned into someone that would fit more with Batman's rogues gallery. There have been a few different stories about his origin, and he's kind of morphed from somebody that was, just kind of a genius, inventor that decided that he wanted some more money by robbing banks, etc., to someone that had a very fragile psyche, and he would be evil and then get arrested, and he would reform and then he'd turn back evil, and run-ins with Lex Luthor, other supervillains. And it's a very just interesting way that you see different writers handle him, because at least with other villains, when there's a reboot of a universe, there's almost this sense of, okay, some things can change depending on who the character is, but not a lot. But Toyman, it always just kind of feels like they're not quite sure what they want Toyman to be. So there have been other Toymen. There have been other Toymen in different animated series, and it's never consistently Winslow as Toyman. There's another Toyman named Jack Nimble. Winslow actually is in jail, but then snaps again and ends up killing Jack Nimble because he is not as good of a Toyman as the original. So a lot of fractured psyche going on with Toyman. Again, probably fits more with Batman. And then even in his adaptations, like for TV shows, it's not consistent that it's Winslow, and it's not. And sometimes they make up, like, this is Winslow's son and his dad was the Toyman. So it's not like you don't run into an adaptation of him where it's consistent. And even consistently, whether he's the bad guy, whether he's the villain, is he just annoying, or is he belong in Arkham, essentially? And speaking of Arkham, there's a little Easter egg in one of the Arkham games that lists his name. He wants to potentially buy up some technology that was taken away by the Gotham City Police Department, and he's listed as a potential person of interest that would abscond with that. He's a mechanical genius, a great engineer. He invents his own toys. One of his potential origin stories is that the military wanted to buy some of his technology, and he said no and got into a fight with the military about it. Another one is that he lost his job at a toy factory due to Lex Luthor, and that's what turned him bad. So there's a whole lot of origin stories for Winslow. He was the one that teamed up with the prankster in Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Essentially, they find out that Clark Kent is Superman. Clark Kent is a newscaster at this point in his career. They bust into the newsroom, and they've got some machine guns, and they basically shoot Clark Kent. And Clark Kent is not injured, of course, because he's Superman, but unfortunately, he does not have a bulletproof suit. He's got his Superman logo that shows up after the suit is shredded. So that's Toyman. We have him ranked personality-wise at 3, powers at 2, mythology, design, and cultural impact all at 3s for the Toyman. Next, we go to someone who really is a legendary villain, and he's actually one that you may not have heard of, and that is the Ultra Humanite. There's probably some alternate universe somewhere where he is Superman's archenemy that shows up every single TV show. The initial plan was that Lex Luthor was not going to be the nemesis of Superman. He was going to be the Ultra Humanite. The writers, Siegel and Schuster, wanted the Ultra Humanite to be essentially the opposite of Superman. So he was a mad scientist, a cripple, couldn't get out of his wheelchair, and he was scheming behind the scenes against Superman, and he had all these scientific methods to essentially win the fight against Superman. Didn't really work out for him. The most interesting thing about him is he transfers his mind, his brain, from individual to essentially remain immortal. So you have a super genius, mad scientist, the very first supervillain in DC Comics. He essentially starts off trying to match his brain with Superman's might. Doesn't work out for him. He switches his brain a number of different people, one of them being Johnny Thunder, infiltrates the Justice Society. And finally, and most well-known, is he switches his mind into the skull of a albino white gorilla from Gorilla City. And that's how most people know him. In fact, most people probably just think he is another Gorilla Grodd, who is one of the Flash's archenemies. He's not. It's a very different character. This is essentially a now immortal brain moving from person to person, and he's stuck around pretty much in the skull of this giant albino gorilla. Telepathy, telekinesis, hypnosis, mental powers, his specialty. Super intelligent, great inventor. Shows up in a lot of animated shows. The 90s animated universe from DC, Justice League, Young Justice, Brave and the Bold. Recently, he's also fought against Monkey Prince, who is a fairly new character in the DC universe. He's also a boss in DC Universe Online. Most recently that I've read, The Flash finds out that Gorilla Grodd is essentially using a cloned brain of Ultra's as a living calculator. Kind of a trippy history, but interestingly enough, more straightforward than someone like the Toyman. Ultra, even from 1939, which is when he first appeared in Action Comics 13, has essentially stayed the same. There have been additions to his mythology, such as the brain transferring. One of the first ways that DC combated a villain dying in flames at the end of one issue, and then him being a popular villain and them saying, we need to bring this guy back. Well, you didn't see a body. In comic books, if you don't see a body, then there's no death. That's the Ultra Humanite. He ranks 4 with personality, 3 for powers, mythology, and design, and cultural impact of 4, being that he is essentially the first DC supervillain ever. So that is Ultra Humanite. So if you don't know who he is, that's okay. You'll probably know who the next villain on here is, and he's not, strictly speaking, a villain. He is just a mischief maker, and that is the one and only... I practice this, but of course you can practice this name all that you want, and you won't necessarily get it right. Mr. Mixius Pitlick, and that is... we're just going to call him Mixie for the remainder of this show, because I'm not about to get tongue-tied every 2 seconds. But he first appeared in Superman 30 in 1944. He is an imp from the 5th dimension, which has been more or less confirmed that is essentially the realm of imagination. He's one of the most powerful characters in all of DC Comics, and as a result, even when you have a character that powerful who can essentially bend reality and create almost whatever he wants, that's a very difficult villain to write, even when you're fighting Superman, because you have a villain like Mixie who doesn't have any constraints except the ones he puts on himself. The most famous thing is Superman must get him to spell his name backwards, and that is not actually a weakness that he has. That's a weakness that he puts on himself to make it more of a game. There's stories like Emperor Joker, where the Joker steals his powers, and so you actually have a villainous character who is going to do real harm to the universe. Mixie usually returns things to normal once he's done and goes back to the 5th dimension. At one point, he even saves Superman because I don't want to say consider Superman a friend, but he likes pestering Superman. And at one point, Superman is about to die from a kryptonite poisoning, and Mixie comes in and saves him, and because essentially he wants to bother Superman another day. So this is another Siegel and Schuster creation. One of my favorite introductions in almost all of comics, I would say, is Mixie's. He's lying in the middle of a street after getting hit by a truck, and the ambulance shows up. They can't lift him. They can't get him off the ground. And they're like, there's this little old guy in the street. We can't figure out how to, lift him. And then he was like, oh, nope, I'm alive the whole time. And then he goes off looking for McGurk. We don't really have an answer as to who McGurk is. He is famously voiced, I should say, by Gilbert Gottfried. That's in most of his animated appearances. He's also shown up as a character in Smallville, Lois and Clark, and the Superboy series. Again, reality-bending powers. He has the power of imagination. That's what he's limited by, and he has a very strong power of imagination. Also, little-known fact, and this is, I feel like, perfect because Superman, the movie, came out this weekend. Fantastic Four is coming out in a couple weeks. It's been essentially confirmed that he's the same character as Marvel's Impossible Man, and Impossible Man is primarily a Fantastic Four villain. When I say villain, very loosely, he's not a bad individual. He is a very mischievous one, though, and that is the case with Mixie as well. We've got his personality. Now, I thought about putting it at a 4, but he can be really abrasive and annoying, so I left it at a 3. His powers at a 5, mythology 4, design 3, and I left it at 3. He's kind of famous for that purple bowler hat. They've changed his design a little bit more recently. Cultural impact 4 for Mixie as well. And that leads us to number 1, who you probably would have guessed, and that's sometimes the difficulty in these videos, like, oh, who's going to be number 1? Well, it's going to be obvious. We've got Lex Luthor, of course, and as I mentioned with the Ultra Humanite segment, Lex was not intended to be Superman's nemesis originally. Ultra Humanite and Lex just kind of switched reins, and Lex took over as the nemesis. But before we get into that, there's a little bit of a controversy about Lex's first appearance. And if you go to a lot of the official sites, it will say Action Comics 23. Now, I will maintain, because I have a very specific, and because I do shows like this, I want it to be concrete definition of what a first appearance is. And if you say, well, wait, why do you have to have a definition? And it's times exactly like this where you have to have a definition. First appearance. I keep it very simple. When is the first time this character showed up? I don't really bother with cameos, etc. It's important for some sites and venues and individuals because maybe they're more concerned about the comic book market or what a comic book is worth. I'm more concerned with when is the first time a character appeared, because the whole reason that a first appearance is significant is that it's the first time the character was published. What's the difference between a cameo and a full appearance, except for the character's in more pages in the full appearance? The whole reason you're interested in the book is that it's the first time this character showed up, right? So it shouldn't matter whether it's in one panel or 50. Again, I'm not really talking about the value. I don't really care so much about the value. For me, it's the historical aspect of this is the first time this character showed up in the pages of a comic book. And that goes by date, and that goes by whether you can see the character or not. So if it's just the character's voice, that doesn't count. And also the whole storyline thing, which is what we're going to get into with Lex. We shouldn't have to define it, but apparently we do. So first time, chronological. That's how you go. 1939 comes before 1940. October comes before November. Easy. Appearance is when they show up. Now you can say story-wise, like, well, yeah, he only shows up for a little bit there, and it doesn't impact the story that much. Okay, that's fine. But what I'm interested in, and a lot of people are interested in, is when was this character first published? That's the big thing, right? It's never, it's hardly ever, what was the first big story this person was involved in? And it's also not necessarily a character's origin, right? Because you have, all the time, you have these series that were published later on that refine character origins. Punisher, for example. Wolverine, another example, is you have these series, these comic series, that are in some cases decades later establishing what the origin is. And so you might have some people say, well, the first appearance, it also kind of depends on, what part of the story is first, which I say, no, that's not really true at all, because you wouldn't tell me that the Wolverine origin series is the first appearance of Wolverine, would you? Because no, because that happens, decades after the Incredible Hulk stories that Wolverine shows up in. You're not saying that Wolverine Origins is Wolverine's first appearance, right? Because that happens decades after his first appearance. So just because something is closer, and now we're getting back to the Lex Luthor thing, that doesn't alter it. So Action Comics 23 is most commonly listed as the first appearance of Lex Luthor. I would maintain it's Superman number 4, and that's based on the data, and that's based on the records we have from DC Comics, and they're out there. They are available. Publication dates. First of all, there's no disputing that the story in Action Comics 23 takes place before the story in Superman 4. Superman number 4 was released on February 15th. Action Comics 23 was released on February 23rd. Which one is chronologically later? Which one? Action Comics. And you can say, well, the story, they messed up the story. Action Comics 23, that story should have been first. The Superman comic at that point was a quarterly publication. So if you look on the cover, it doesn't say a specific month. It says spring of 1940. And so you say, well, that just happened to be released the week before. It wasn't intended that way. To which I say, why does that matter? Because the dates are the date. And you can tell the story out of order. It happens all the time. Like I said in the Wolverine example, what is published first is the first appearance. So if you were going to a comic book store in February of 1940, the first possible time that you would have to see Lex Luthor, Superman 4, on the 15th of February. If you came back the next week, then you could get Action Comics 23. First, the first time a character is there, chronologically, appearance, the first time you see the character. And the first time you could possibly see Lex Luthor in the pages of a comic book was February 15th, 1940, Superman number 4. Talking about the actual character Lex Luthor, as opposed to Toyman, who has all these different changes being made, it's super interesting because Lex actually has a lot of changes too, many of those due to the multiverse. And you have writers and editors really significantly changing who Lex is, but only in terms of essentially where he came from. So in almost every version of Lex, you have a very egotistical, very intelligent individual. smarter than Superman, not as strong as Superman, obviously, and that is where a lot of the conflict comes into play. Lex doesn't like Superman because he's an alien. Lex thinks that humanity should be able to take care of themselves, and so on. Now, where Lex comes from changes a lot. So you have kind of the Smallville origin, where he grows up in Smallville because his family moved there, and that's where he meets Clark for the first time. You also have a few other different versions where that's not the case. Maybe they passed through once, but that's not where he grew up. More recently, it's said that he left Smallville and went to Metropolis and became a vigilante, a superhero vigilante, and then changed his mind. There's been this evolution through the years. He's a mad scientist sometimes. Then after the Crisis on Infinite Earths, they revamp him a little bit, so he's more of a businessman. Of course, he famously becomes president at one point, and he's brought back again to being more of a scientific genius, where he's designing these super suits to rival Superman's powers. He comes up with the Legion of Doom, founds the Legion of Doom, creates Superboy, who is a clone of Superman. He weaponizes kryptonite. He more recently founds a company called Supercorps, where he's trying to team up with Superman to protect Metropolis. He joins the Justice League. He goes through all of these different itinerations. He's always very conceited. He always turns back to the villain side, and he's always getting undercut by his own pride. And that's something that has come back to hurt him. For example, many times there has been evidence in front of him that says Clark Kent is Superman, and he says, no, there's no possible way this man that has such immense power could be a mild-mannered reporter. Lex is a character I didn't really like that much growing up. I thought he was boring. I didn't see anything significant about a guy that just sat around an office building and glared at Superman out the window. As you read more about him, you realize how complex he is, the family dynamic. Of course, one of the most telling things fairly recently is in the Blackest Night story, where he gets an orange ring, which is, of course, avarice, and jealous of Superman, jealous of his popularity, wants to be Superman, and is always trying to be one step ahead. We could go on for a very, very, very long time with Lex. Maybe I'll do an entire episode with Lex, but one of the most iconic supervillains of all time. If there was a Mount Rushmore of supervillains, I'm sure Lex would be on it. Lyle Talbot, one of my favorite old school black and white actors, portrayed him in the George Reeves Atom Man versus Superman serial way back when. Gene Hackman, Kevin Spacey, Jesse Eisenberg, of course, Nicholas Hoult in the Superman movie that is released just this weekend. All actors that have portrayed him. Huge presence in the animated DC series, Smallville, Lois and Clark, Superboy, video games, Injustice, the Lego games. He's a playable character in both of those. There's an Easter egg in Arkham Knight, the Batman game, where if you go into Bruce Wayne's office at Wayne Enterprises, Lex has left a message on the voicemail. Lex Luthor, obviously the number one villain from this time, one of the most iconic comic book characters ever created. And so we went with 5s across the board for him, except for powers, because he's a human. We actually put 4 because his intellect, and we also wrap technology kind of into the powers section of things, and his technology and intellect are so powerful, so strong. Definitely number 1 here, one of the upper echelon of super villains. And I'm looking forward to see Nicholas Hoult portray him. I hope you enjoyed this top 10 list. We'll review quick. Number 10, Funny Face. Number 9, Butch Matson and B. Carroll. Number 8, Swami Riva, a.k.a. Daniel Rivers. Number 7, J. Wilbur Wolfingham. Number 6, The Puzzler. Number 5, The Prankster. Number 4, Toyman. Number 3, Ultra Humanite. Number 2, Mr. Mixyazpitlik. And number 1, of course, Lex Luthor. Thanks for listening. This is Supervillain Spotlight from Daventry Studios.